Hello and welcome to this lecture. My name is Kelli Dickerson, and I am really excited to be able to share an overview with you today about the science of adolescent development, including how it relates to the use of digital technology and mHealth interventions. To give you a little bit of background about myself, I am a developmental psychologist. I did my doctoral training at the University of California, Irvine. I then completed a postdoc in developmental cognitive neuroscience at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Then I spent some time in the consulting world, providing scientific support to foundations, conducting work in the health and education space. I'm currently a research manager with CERES, where I lead interdisciplinary projects testing the impacts of digital technologies on learning and development. I have particular interests in testing scalable methods of promoting health and well-being that can greatly expand the reach of interventions to underserved and vulnerable populations. I want to start with an overview of my talk today. So I'm going to start by sharing some core principles and findings from the developmental science of adolescence. I'll zoom into the transition from childhood to adolescence, what we think of as early adolescence, as a potentially significant inflection point, not only for establishing negative developmental trajectories that have the potential to carry lifelong impacts for adolescents, but also for promoting positive trajectories that can shape adolescents' futures in important ways. In doing so, I hope to convey an idea that is rapidly gaining traction in developmental science. And that's the idea that the kind of dynamic growth and changes and unique potential for learning that occur during adolescence make this a pivotal point for prevention and intervention. Next, I'll place adolescent development in context and talk about how digital technologies have really transformed adolescents' daily worlds, becoming a core social context in which adolescents are learning about themselves and others, and also tackling some of the key developmental milestones of adolescence. I'll also discuss what existing research tells us about the linkages between digital technology use and adolescent well-being. I'll conclude with a discussion of the promise of digital interventions that build on the developmental science of adolescence in addressing growing mental health challenges in this population, and also opportunities and considerations for advancing the broader evidence base for these tools. So what is developmental science? Well, developmental science is concerned with the patterns and processes of biological, cognitive, and behavioral changes that occur as we grow and mature. When thinking about adolescence, this is the transitional period from childhood to adulthood that begins with the onset of puberty and ends with the transition to adult roles and responsibilities. As this figure shows, we often think about adolescence in terms of different phases, like early adolescence and late adolescence. But we also recognize that these phases are somewhat fluid in terms of age boundaries, and are based, at least partly, on socially constructed transition points, like the transition from primary to secondary school. What this figure also reflects is the growing belief that adolescence may extend much longer than we initially thought, as far as potentially age 24 or so. This kind of reconceptualization of adolescence is meant to kind of reflect and correspond to changes in what we're seeing in the life course of younger generations, who tend to show delays in meeting what are traditionally considered adult milestones, such as getting married and having kids. So now that we've discussed the general bounds of adolescence, I want to get a bit into the biology and psychology of adolescence. As I'm sure you can recall from your own experience, a hallmark of adolescence is dynamic and transformational change across many different systems. It begins with the onset of puberty, which starts a cascade of changes in the body, including rapid acceleration of physical growth, changes in sleep patterns and metabolism, and ultimately sexual maturation. At the same time, adolescents' brains are undergoing extensive maturation and rewiring. Neural systems, especially those involved in higher order cognitive processes, emotions, social functioning, and motivations, show striking structural and functional changes during adolescence. These neurobiological changes are in turn associated with behavioral changes. This includes increased sensation seeking and risk taking during adolescence, as well as a greater sensitivity to the social world. During adolescence, peers, reputation and status, and sexual and romantic interests become highly salient motivations. Adolescents also become especially sensitive to social evaluation, social exclusion, and social rewards. It's also the case that social contexts and also social roles and responsibilities shift profoundly during adolescence. This occurs as youth navigate more complex social situations and interactions and move towards greater autonomy. Together, these changes make adolescence a period of intense informational learning, particularly in social and emotional domains. While from a physical standpoint, adolescence is the healthiest period of the lifespan, it's also, interestingly, a period marked by significant elevations in morbidity and mortality. And the drivers of this are largely problems in regulating emotions, behaviors, and impulses. This adolescent health paradox, as some call it, is reflected in increasing rates of accidents, aggression and violent crime, mental health conditions, substance use, risky sexual behavior, and so on. So I'm going to show some figures that illustrate these striking increases in morbidity or mortality across adolescence, and that also point towards some interesting developmental trends that are worth unpacking. So this figure here shows data from the Global Burden of Disease study. This is a kind of massive undertaking which is specifically designed to quantify the magnitude of all major diseases, injuries, and clinical outcomes related to those diseases and injuries at a global scale. The figure here focuses specifically on the burden of mental health and substance use disorders. These are listed on the right and include such conditions as depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, and eating disorders. I want to orient you to the graph. So on the y-axis is the overall disease burden of a given mental health or substance use condition in disability-adjusted life years. And on the x-axis is age, which is grouped into different categories ranging from less than 1 year of age to 80 years and older. What you can clearly see from this figure is the rise of many different health disorders during the adolescent period. This is particularly true for depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, alcohol use disorders, and other drug use disorders. So let's zoom in a bit more. The findings on this slide are from a recent meta-analysis of 192 epidemiological studies, and they show the distribution of age of onset for a range of mental health disorders. The findings here virtually parallel those of the prior slide in that they show the rise of mental health conditions across adolescence, which then decline across adulthood. For the particular condition shown here, the peak age of onset appears to be around late adolescence, early adulthood. What developmental scientists have also been interested in, though, from an intervention and prevention standpoint, is when we first start to see the emergence of these conditions. For each of these 3 mental health conditions, as well as others that aren't pictured here, they generally start occurring in early adolescence or kind of around that 10 to 15 or so window. And it's not just mental health concerns that show this pattern of an emergence around early adolescence. Looking across many different behavioral concerns, the 10 to 15 window often marks the start of these issues. The figure I'm showing here shows the classic age crime curve. This shows high rates of violent crime, so murder, rape, and robbery, between the 8 to 25-year-old kind of age range. But also, interestingly, an onset of around 10 to 15 or so for these behaviors. Similar patterns of an early adolescent emergence can be seen not only with violent crime, but also with many other health risk behaviors, including smoking initiation, fatal injuries, and non-fatal injuries due to self-harm. So, taken together, early adolescence appears to be a period of vulnerability, a kind of potential inflection point for establishing negative developmental trajectories, including within mental health domains. What developmental scientists are increasingly recognizing is that it may also be an inflection point for promoting positive developmental trajectories, and therefore an important time for prevention and intervention. This is a period in which youth are establishing behaviors, preferences, identities, and views about themselves and others that carry lifelong influences on health and well-being. Adolescence is also now believed to be a sensitive period for learning. Next only to infancy, it represents the period of the most rapid growth and development across neural, behavioral, and social domains. Adolescents' brains are rewiring in ways that mature higher order cognitive functions, but that also create tendencies to explore and engage, and that make teens especially sensitive to their social world. This has been referred to as social reorientation during adolescence and tends to manifest in increases in sensitivity to social evaluation and exclusion, increased motivation to gain kind of social status, as well as enhanced motivation to engage with peers. The plasticity of the adolescent brain means that there are opportunities for experiences to shape and strengthen connections. It also means that how young people spend their time can have lifelong consequences on brain function and mental health. When considering adolescent development, we also need to consider the context in which development is unfolding. In recent years, the digital world has become a core context for learning and development among young people. Adolescents are avid users of technology. The vast majority of adolescents in the US have smartphones or other internet-enabled devices, and most teens acquire their first smartphone as early as 10 to 12 years of age. Technology undoubtedly affords adolescents unprecedented opportunities for connection that also appeal to many of the core motivations of the adolescent period, such as the motivation to explore peer relationships and pursue novel experiences, and also to do so in a relatively independent and unsupervised manner. It is no surprise that adolescents' media consumption is at an all-time high. Prior to the pandemic, US teens spent an average of nearly 7.5 hours online each day, excluding time spent online for educational activities. That figure is expected to have increased substantially with the pandemic, as virtual connection became the primary means of access to social networks and education for many youth. The outlook about adolescence and digital technology is not universally positive. In recent years, there have been growing concerns that this continuous connectivity is harmful to adolescent health and well-being, especially given the global mental health crisis among young people that has coincided with increases in adolescents' engagement with digital technologies. To give a few examples of the mental health crisis, recent reports from the CDC Youth Risk Behavior Survey paint an alarming picture of rates of depression and suicidal ideation and behavior among adolescents. As you can see in this figure, persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness, which are indicators of depression, have increased dramatically among adolescents. And this is especially true of female adolescents. From 2011 to 2021, these symptoms rose from 36 to 57% among girls. That is, in 2021, nearly 60% of girls reported experiencing persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. Similar findings have been found with suicidal ideation. It's also shown marked increases among adolescents, and again, particularly among female adolescents. And it's not just ideation. The percentage of female adolescents who made a suicide plan or attempted suicide has also increased at alarming rates. These rapid increases in mental health symptoms among adolescents have led to intense debates, with many arguing that digital technology use is to blame for these increases. In light of these concerns, there has been increasing research dedicated towards understanding the potential impacts of these technologies on adolescent health and well-being. This research has found inconsistent associations between digital technology use and well-being, but the most rigorous studies generally find null or very small negative associations. The kind of takeaway to date is that there is little evidence of a strong or robust connection between time spent online and adolescents' mental health and well-being. The figure on the right details one such finding. What this figure is showing is mental well-being as a function of daily digital screen time on weekdays and weekends. The blue lines are time spent on smartphones, either on the weekday or weekend, and the other lines represent time spent watching TV and movies, playing video games, or using computers. What this particular study found was that there was no association at moderate levels of screen time and a negative association at high levels of screen time. But this association is very small, accounting for less than 1% of the variance explained. It's also worth noting that much of the research to date in this area is correlational. Digital technology use may have consequences for adolescents in terms of impacting mental health symptoms, but it's also likely that mental health symptoms may drive patterns of digital technology use. When it comes to associations with social relationships, research on adolescents suggests that for most, virtual interactions are used to strengthen existing relationships. There are substantial overlaps between adolescents' offline and online social networks, and most online exchanges between peers tend to be positive or neutral. So contrary to some concerns, it doesn't appear that young people are missing out on opportunities to develop and maintain close relationships and build key social skills and spending more time on their mobile devices. But again, findings are not uniformly positive. Most adolescents have been involved in or witnessed cyberbullying or victimization. And these experiences are associated with negative outcomes like depression, loneliness, and fear. In the arena of cyberbullying, as well as other aspects of adolescents' online lives, it seems as though online experiences and risks tend to mirror those of adolescents' offline lives, helping to explain whether adolescents tend to have positive or negative experiences in the digital world. For instance, adolescents who are bullies or victims online also tend to be those who are bullies or victims offline. Of course, we know that mobile platforms can amplify some of those offline risks due to added kind of risks like the anonymity of the online world, as well as youth's near constant connection to digital devices. Another important point when considering adolescent development in the context of the digital age is the existence of the digital divide. The digital divide refers to the notion that vulnerable youth would kind of benefit most from access to online resources and support, but tend to be the least supported in their learning and use of technology, in the tailoring of digital tools to their needs, and also access to supportive communities and networks. This contributes to what some call a rich get richer pattern of associations between digital technology use and youth well-being that can augment existing inequalities in education, mental health, and future success. Moving forward, there is a clear need for more equitable solution in terms of access, supports, and opportunities so that vulnerable youth can also experience the health promoting affordances of digital technology. So I now want to turn to the promise of mHealth in the adolescent space and talk about some opportunities for advancing the evidence base in this area. So at least in higher income countries like the United States, the vast majority of adolescents are online. And they're also naturally turning to online spaces for information and support. Meeting them where they're at seems like a more likely way to achieve impacts at scale than waiting for adolescents to kind of go to a clinic or to a counselor. We also know that demand for mental health providers is far outpacing supply. Digital tools and interventions could enable more timely delivery of services for adolescents, perhaps even at critical moments like during crises. And they also have the benefit of potentially reaching youth who would not otherwise access mental health services. Unfortunately, the promise of digital mental health tools has not yet been realized with adolescents. To advance the space, there are a few areas, among likely many others, that require innovation. I'll just kind of talk about a few of them today. So kind of the first area is that adolescents are highly interested in receiving online mental health supports, but there's actually quite low availability of these supports for adolescents. Most mental health apps are not designed with adolescents in mind, and few, if any, adolescent-based apps are evidence-based. This could potentially be due to the higher burden around kind of data protection, storage, and obtaining informed consent for minors. The second issue is that of the existing apps that target adolescents, there is a disconnect between the supports that are offered and the developmental needs of adolescents. Many of the apps for adolescents are just repackaged adult interventions. Some have made surface level changes that could appeal to adolescents, for example, in changing aesthetics to be more youthful. But for the most part, they continue to use adult-centric language and neglect to leverage some of the social features like social connection and peer engagement that may be especially salient to adolescents. There is a clear need for more than cosmetic changes in this space, and this will require actually engaging adolescents in the design, testing, and validation of mHealth products. The final opportunity for innovation that I'll discuss today is personalization. This could be absolutely game-changing in the adolescent space. As I've alluded to, there is heterogeneity across adolescents in the links between digital technology use and mental health, such that more vulnerable youth may be more likely to have negative experiences online that have the potential to exacerbate mental health concerns. As we know, there's also heterogeneity in the impacts of digital mental health interventions across users. One-size-fits-all models are not likely to be extremely effective in this space in kind of optimizing interventions to support adolescents' health and well-being. This is kind of one area where many are recognizing the potential of machine learning models as useful tools, given that they can optimize predictions for specific individuals and targeted outcomes, and thus be used to personalize interventions. Tailoring interventions to different subgroups of adolescents can also help address the digital divide. We talked earlier about a rich get richer pattern of influence in terms of differential access to and tailoring of digital technologies and supports among adolescents. Just as machine learning models could be used to personalize interventions, they could also potentially be used to monitor gaps in learning and health and identify where greater resources or innovations are needed. So in sum, I hope this lecture has gotten you thinking a bit about adolescent development, and especially the promise of digital tools and interventions in promoting kind of health and well-being during this period in which youth are really ideally poised to learn and absorb new information. And also when we first start to see many emotional and behavioral problems emerge. Investing in online therapies and supports has the potential to reach greater numbers of youth, to reduce gaps in treatment access, and ultimately to reduce the lifetime burden of disease due to mental health problems. But as mentioned, there are clear needs to advance the evidence base in this domain and to employ and refine innovative strategies of tailoring digital interventions to this particular developmental window. Thank you all for tuning in today. It has been a pleasure giving this lecture, and I hope you enjoy the upcoming Training Institute. If you have any questions or feedback about this talk, please don't hesitate to contact me at this email. Thank you.